May 7, 1942. The Pacific Ocean churned with the violence of war as the USS Yorktown limped away from the Coral Sea, trailing oil and listing slightly to port. Deep within her hull, seawater sloshed through corridors that should have been bone dry. The carrier's crew worked frantically, their faces streaked with sweat and grime, as they fought to keep their wounded ship afloat. Above them, 3 decks up, a gaping hole in the flight deck yawned open to the sky, a wound inflicted by a Japanese bomb that had torn through steel and wood like paper. The Battle of the Coral Sea had ended, but for the men aboard Yorktown, the fight for survival had just begun. Commander Clarence Aldrich stood on the bridge, his hands gripping the rail as he surveyed the damage. Around him, damage control reports flooded in through speaking tubes and telephone circuits. Each one painted a grimmer picture than the last. The bomb that struck them had penetrated deep into the ship's vitals, destroying fuel tanks, rupturing steam lines, and creating a crater 24 feet across in the flight deck. 11 men had been lost in the initial explosion. Another 66 were wounded, many of them burned terribly by flashing steam and ignited aviation fuel. But Yorktown was still afloat, still moving, still fighting. Captain Elliot Buckmaster paced the bridge, calculating distances and fuel consumption in his head. They were over 3,000 miles from the nearest major repair facility at Pearl Harbor. At their current speed of 16 knots, reduced from their usual 33-knot sprint, it would take them 9 days to reach safety. 9 days during which Japanese submarines could be stalking them through the dark Pacific depths. 9 days during which a storm could finish what the enemy bombs had started. The ship's chief engineer, a gruff veteran named Commander Jack Delaney, emerged from below decks. His khaki uniform was soaked through with a mixture of seawater, fuel oil, and his own sweat. Buckmaster turned to him immediately. "How bad is it, Jack?" Delaney wiped his face with an already filthy handkerchief. "We've got the flooding under control for now, sir, but that bomb went through us like we were made of cardboard. The fuel tanks are compromised, we're leaking oil, and the structural damage extends 3 decks down. We've shored up what we can with timbers, but it's temporary at best." Buckmaster nodded slowly. "Can she make it to Pearl?" "If the weather holds and we don't push her too hard, yes, sir. But she'll need months in dry dock to fix this properly, months we don't have." The captain's jaw tightened. Unknown to most of the crew, intelligence reports had been flooding into Admiral Nimitz's headquarters. The Japanese were planning something big, something that would make the Coral Sea look like a preliminary bout. Code breakers at Station Hypo in Hawaii had intercepted and partially decrypted enemy communications, referring to a target designated AF. Through clever subterfuge, they'd confirmed that AF was Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of coral and sand 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. And the Japanese were sending their entire carrier fleet to take it. America's response would require every available carrier. The Lexington had been lost at Coral Sea, sent to the bottom by Japanese torpedoes and her own secondary explosions. The Saratoga was still on the west coast, recovering from torpedo damage inflicted months earlier. That left only 3 American carriers in the Pacific: Enterprise, Hornet, and the badly wounded Yorktown. They couldn't afford to lose her. As Yorktown steamed toward Pearl Harbor, her crew worked around the clock. In the hangar deck, aviation mechanics cannibalized damaged aircraft for parts to keep the surviving planes operational. In the engine rooms, machinists jury-rigged repairs to damaged steam lines. In the galleys, cooks stretched food supplies to feed over 2,000 men without access to proper refrigeration in the damaged storage compartments. And deep in the bowels of the ship near Frame 97, a group of welders worked in conditions that would have violated every safety regulation in peacetime. They were sealing off the damaged fuel tanks, working in compartments filled with explosive vapor, their torches creating cascades of sparks that could ignite the fumes at any moment. They worked in shifts, 15 minutes on, 15 minutes off, because the heat and the danger were simply too intense to endure any longer. One of these welders was a young man from Oklahoma named James "Jimmy" Morrison. Before the war, Jimmy had worked in the oil fields outside Tulsa, welding pipeline sections in the scorching summer heat. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, he'd enlisted the next day, lying about his poor eyesight to get past the medical examination. The Navy had recognized his welding skills and assigned him to the Damage Control Division aboard Yorktown. Now 23 years old and 5,000 miles from home, Jimmy found himself doing the most important work of his life in a space barely wide enough to turn around in. The bomb damage had ruptured bulkheads and twisted support beams. Water sloshed around his ankles, and the air was thick with oil vapor. His welding mask was fogged with condensation, and his hands shook from exhaustion, but he kept working, laying bead after bead of weld along the fractured seams. "That's good enough, Morrison," his supervisor called down through the access hatch. "We need to move on to the next section." Jimmy pulled off his mask and looked at his work. It wasn't pretty. The welds were rough, with splatter marks and uneven beads. In peacetime, a job like this would have failed inspection. But these weren't normal times, and perfection was a luxury they couldn't afford. "It'll hold," he said, more to himself than to his supervisor. And it did. For 9 days, as Yorktown crossed the Pacific, Jimmy's welds and those of his fellow damage control specialists held back the ocean. They held through heavy seas that sent green water crashing across the flight deck. They held through speed trials when Buckmaster tested the engines to see how fast they dared push the damaged ship. They held when depth charges exploded in the distance as escorting destroyers hunted suspected submarine contacts. On May 27th, Yorktown steamed through the anti-submarine nets protecting Pearl Harbor. On the bridge, officers and enlisted men alike lined the rails, looking at the evidence of December 7th's devastation that still scarred the harbor. The overturned hull of the Oklahoma rose from the water like a steel island. The salvaged remains of other battleships sat in dry docks, their superstructures twisted and burned. As Yorktown approached her berth, Captain Buckmaster could see a crowd gathering on the pier. But these weren't the usual collection of wives and sweethearts waiting to welcome a ship home. These were workmen, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. They stood in groups, carrying toolboxes and equipment, wearing the dungarees and hard hats of the Pearl Harbor Navy Yard. Admiral Chester Nimitz himself was waiting on the pier. As soon as the brow was lowered, he strode aboard, returning Buckmaster's salute with crisp precision. "Captain, I need your ship," Nimitz said without preamble. "How long will repairs take?" Buckmaster had been dreading this question. He'd consulted with his engineering staff during the voyage home. They'd gone over every inch of damage, calculated every repair that would be needed to restore Yorktown to full fighting capability. "Admiral, we estimate 90 days minimum. The bomb damage is extensive. We need to replace entire sections of hull plating, rebuild 3 decks worth of structure, replace fuel tanks, repair steam lines, and resurface the flight deck. In a perfect world, with all the resources we need, 90 days would be optimistic." Nimitz's expression didn't change. "You have 72 hours. Buckmaster felt the blood drain from his face. "Sir, that's impossible. The ship needs to go into dry dock. We need to—" 72 hours, Captain. The Japanese are coming to Midway. They'll be there in 5 days. I need every carrier I have to stop them. Can you make Yorktown ready to fight in 3 days? Buckmaster looked at his ship, at the gaping hole in her flight deck, at the oil stains marking where fuel still leaked from her wounds. Then he looked at Admiral Nimitz, at the determination in the old man's eyes, and he understood. This wasn't about what was possible. This was about what was necessary. "We'll be ready, sir," Nimitz nodded once. "I'm giving you every resource in the Navy Yard. Use them." What happened next would become legend in the annals of naval repair history. Before Yorktown had even finished tying up to the pier, workers were swarming up her gangways. They didn't wait for formal orders or detailed work assignments. They simply found the damage and started fixing it. The Navy Yard Commandant, Captain Homer Wallen, had organized a miracle. He'd pulled workers off other projects, canceled shore leave for the entire yard workforce, and commandeered supplies from repair jobs that could wait. Within an hour of Yorktown's arrival, 1,400 civilian workers and Navy personnel were aboard the ship, working on dozens of repair projects simultaneously. The noise was deafening. Rivet guns chattered like machine guns. Welding torches sizzled and popped. Pneumatic hammers pounded out dents in steel plates. Power saws shrieked as they cut away damaged sections. Generators roared as they provided power for hundreds of electrical tools, and through it all, the constant sound of men shouting to be heard over the industrial symphony. Jimmy Morrison and his damage control team found themselves reassigned to work with the yard's master welders. These were old hands, many of them in their 50s and 60s, men who had been welding ships since before Jimmy was born. They took one look at the bomb damage and started organizing the younger sailors into teams. "All right, boys," one grizzled veteran announced. "We're going to cut away the damaged sections and weld in new plates. We're not trying to make it pretty. We're trying to make it strong enough to keep the ocean out and hold together when those Jap bombs start falling again. You understand?" They understood. The work proceeded with organized chaos. On the flight deck, construction crews used pneumatic saws to cut away the damaged wood planking and bent steel supports. The crater was simply too large to repair properly in 3 days, so they did the next best thing. They filled it. Steel beams were welded into a framework, then covered with thick wooden planking. It wouldn't be as strong as the original deck, but it would be strong enough to land aircraft on. Probably. 3 decks below, at the site of the original bomb penetration, Jimmy and his team faced their biggest challenge. The explosion had torn apart a complex junction where fuel lines, steam pipes, electrical conduits, and structural supports all came together. The damage extended across 3 decks and involved systems that weren't even in the same department. Fixing it properly would require disassembling and rebuilding entire sections of the ship. They had 3 days. The solution that the master welders devised was simultaneously elegant and crude. They would cut away the damaged sections, weld in new plates without trying to precisely match the original hull lines, and seal everything with extra layers of steel were necessary. It would add weight. It would create drag in the water. And it would look terrible, but it would work. Jimmy found himself assigned to the most critical section of the repair, the hull plates near frame 97, right at the waterline. This was where the bomb's explosion had transmitted its shock through the ship's structure, cracking welds and splitting plates in areas that hadn't even been directly hit. If these cracks weren't sealed properly, Yorktown would take on water in any kind of heavy sea. The problem was access. The damaged area was in a narrow void space between the outer hull and an inner bulkhead barely 18 inches wide. A full-grown man could barely squeeze into it and certainly couldn't maneuver with any freedom. But the welds had to be made, and they had to be made right. Jimmy was the smallest welder in his team. At 5'7" and 140 pounds, he could fit where larger men couldn't. So down he went, squeezing through an access hatch and into the narrow space, dragging his welding cables behind him. The conditions were nightmarish. The space was hot, over 100 degrees, because it was right next to the engine rooms where boilers were being tested. It was dark, lit only by the glow of his welding arc. The air was thick with the smell of fuel oil and bilge water. And it was cramped, so cramped that he had to work in contorted positions, his arms twisted at awkward angles, his face pressed against steel plates that were hot enough to raise blisters. "How's it going down there, Morrison?" his supervisor called down through the access hatch. "Like welding in hell, sir," Jimmy called back. "That's the spirit. Keep at it." For 18 hours straight, Jimmy worked in that void space. He would weld until the heat and the fumes became unbearable, then drag himself out for 15 minutes of fresh air and water before going back down. His hands cramped from gripping the welding stinger in unnatural positions. His neck ached from craning to see his work. His eyes burned from the welding flash, even through his protective mask. But the welds got made. Inch by inch, foot by foot, he sealed the cracks in Yorktown's hull. The work was ugly. The beads were uneven, the penetration inconsistent. It was the kind of work that would have gotten him fired from any respectable shipyard in peacetime. But it was strong. Every weld was solid, every crack was sealed. As Jimmy worked, other teams tackled other problems. In the hangar deck, mechanics worked to repair or replace the damaged aircraft elevators. In the island superstructure, electricians spliced together severed cables and rebuilt damaged switchboards. In the galley, new refrigeration units were installed to replace those destroyed by the bomb. Throughout the ship, wherever there was damage, there were men working to fix it. The pace was relentless. The civilian workers from the Navy Yard worked in 12-hour shifts, but the ship's crew couldn't afford that luxury. They worked until they collapsed from exhaustion, grabbed a few hours of sleep wherever they could find space, then went back to work. Coffee became the unofficial fuel that powered the repair effort. The ship's cooks brewed it by the gallon, strong enough to strip paint, and the workers drank it down without complaint. Captain Buckmaster barely slept during those 3 days. He moved through the ship constantly, checking on progress, making decisions, solving problems. When a shortage of steel plate threatened to delay hull repairs, he authorized cutting plates from non-critical interior bulkheads. When civilian workers refused to work in spaces still contaminated with fuel vapor, he sent in his own sailors to do the job. When supplies ran short, he sent officers into Honolulu with requisition forms and orders to get what they needed by any means necessary. On the evening of the second day, Buckmaster stood on the repaired flight deck with Commander Delaney and the Navy Yard's chief engineer, a civilian named Oscar Carlson. "Well," Buckmaster asked, "can we make the deadline?" Carlson, a heavy-set man, with a cigar perpetually clenched in his teeth, surveyed the work still to be done. "Captain, in a normal yard, with normal procedures, what we've accomplished in 2 days would take 3 weeks. But there's still a lot to do. The flight deck repairs need another 12 hours. The hull welding is behind schedule. We're waiting on parts for the damage control systems, and we haven't even started testing most of the repaired systems." That's not what I asked. Can we make the deadline?" Carlson removed his cigar and looked Buckmaster in the eye. "Sir, if your boys keep working like they have been, and if my men don't drop dead from exhaustion, and if we don't hit any major problems in the next 24 hours, then yes, barely. But I'm telling you right now, this ship won't be at 100%, not even close. We're patching her together with spit and baling wire. Some of these repairs wouldn't pass inspection in peacetime. Will she float? Will she launch aircraft? Will she fight?" "Yes, sir. She'll do all that. But, Captain, you need to understand what you're taking to sea. This ship is hurt. Some of these repairs are temporary at best. If you take serious damage in battle, some of these patches might not hold. The men who did this work are the best I've got. But they're not magicians. We're doing the impossible, not the miraculous." Buckmaster nodded slowly. "I understand, and I'm grateful for everything you and your men have done, but we need this ship at Midway. Whatever condition she's in, we need her there." "Then she'll be there, Captain. You have my word." By the morning of the third day, the work entered its final phase. Teams began cleaning up their work sites, removing tools and equipment, clearing debris. The noise level dropped as rivet guns and welding torches fell silent. Testing began on the repaired systems. Pumps were activated, valves were opened and closed, steam lines were pressurized, electrical circuits were energized, and problems were discovered. A repaired steam line developed a leak under pressure. An electrical switchboard shorted out when energized. A recently welded fuel tank showed signs of seepage. Each problem required another round of repairs, another group of workers descending into the ship's depths to fix what wasn't right. Jimmy Morrison was exhausted beyond anything he'd ever experienced. He'd worked almost continuously for 3 days, grabbing only brief snatches of sleep. His hands were covered in burns and cuts. His eyes were red-rimmed from welding flash. His uniform was stiff with dried sweat and oil. But when word came down that one of his hull patches was showing signs of leaking, he grabbed his welding gear and headed back down without complaint. The leak was tiny, just a few drops of seawater weeping through a crack in one of his welds. In normal circumstances, it would have been a minor issue, easily fixed. But these weren't normal circumstances. That crack was in one of the most difficult-to-reach spots in the ship, and accessing it would require removing part of the temporary patch they'd installed over it. Jimmy squeezed back into the narrow void space, cursing under his breath. He could see the problem immediately. One of his welds had a small inclusion, a spot where contamination had prevented the metal from fusing properly. It was the kind of defect that happened when you were working in filthy conditions, in awkward positions, while exhausted. He set up his welding equipment and went to work. But this time, something was different. His hands, cramped from 3 days of continuous work, began to shake. The welding rod wavered. The arc became unstable. He stopped, took several deep breaths, and tried again. Same result. His body was simply beyond the point of precise control. "Morrison, what's taking so long?" his supervisor called down. "I'm having trouble getting a good arc, sir. My hands won't stop shaking." There was a long pause. Then a different voice came down, older and gravelly. It was one of the Navy Yard master welders, a man named Harold Chen, who was rumored to have helped build Yorktown when she was first launched. "Son, I'm coming down there." "Sir, you won't fit. The space is barely wide enough for me." "Then we'll make it wider. Hold on." For the next hour, Jimmy listened to the sounds of cutting torches and hammers as Chen and his crew enlarged the access to the void space. Finally, Chen squeezed through, carrying his own welding equipment. He was a small man, even shorter than Jimmy, but his arms were thick with muscle from decades of physical work. Chen examined Jimmy's welds with a critical eye, running his fingers along the beads, checking for gaps and irregularities. Finally, he nodded. "Your work's good, son. Real good, especially considering the conditions. This little crack, it's nothing to be ashamed of. Could have happened to anyone. Hell, probably would have happened to me. But it's going to leak, sir. If the ship takes damage in the same area, that crack could split wide open." Chen pulled out his welding stinger and adjusted his settings. "Then we'll fix it. But first, I want you to watch how I do this. See how I'm bracing my arm against this beam. That's the trick when you're working in a tight space. You turn your whole body into a support structure for your hands. Like this," he demonstrated, making several practice passes without striking an arc. Then he lit up and laid down a perfect bead right over the crack, filling it completely. The weld was beautiful, even, and consistent, with no splatter or defects. "Now you try," Chen said, handing over the stinger. Jimmy took it, positioned himself the way Chen had shown him, and struck an arc. This time his hands were steady. The rod flowed smoothly, depositing metal exactly where he wanted it. When he finished, Chen examined the weld and grunted approval. "That's how it's done. Now get topside and get some rack time. You've earned it." "What about the rest of the inspection, sir?" "I'll handle it. You've been down in this hole for 3 days straight. That's enough. Go." Jimmy didn't argue. He dragged himself out of the void space, up through the ship, and found an empty corner of the crew's berthing compartment. He was asleep before his head hit the makeshift pillow he'd fashioned from his jacket. He woke 6 hours later to the sound of the ship's general announcing system crackling to life. Captain Buckmaster's voice echoed through the spaces. "Now hear this! All hands stand by to get underway. Set the Special Sea and anchor detail." Jimmy scrambled to his feet and raced to his general quarters station. Around him, the ship came alive with activity. Sailors ran to their positions. Officers checked stations. Engines rumbled to life far below. On the pier, the Navy Yard workers stood watching as the ship they'd worked so hard to save prepared to leave. Many of them had tears in their eyes. They knew where Yorktown was going. They knew what she would face. And they knew that all their work, all their exhaustion and sacrifice might not be enough. Admiral Nimitz stood on the bridge as Yorktown cast off her lines. Captain Buckmaster approached and saluted. "Sir, USS Yorktown reporting ready for sea." Nimitz returned the salute and extended his hand. "Good luck, Captain. Bring her home." "We'll do our best, sir." As Yorktown moved slowly away from the pier, gaining speed as she headed for the channel, Jimmy stood on the fantail with several of his damage control teammates. They watched Pearl Harbor fall away behind them, watched the workers on the pier grow smaller and smaller until they disappeared. "You think those welds will hold?" one of the other sailors asked. Jimmy thought about his ugly patches, about the crude repairs that would have been rejected in peacetime, about the work that had been done by exhausted men in impossible conditions. "They'll hold," he said, with confidence he didn't entirely feel. "They have to." For 2 days, Yorktown steamed northwest at 25 knots, pushing her repaired engines hard. The patches held. The welds held. Jimmy and his team conducted constant inspections, checking for leaks, for cracks, for any sign that their work was failing. They found nothing. The ugly repairs, for all their lack of elegance, were doing their job. On June 3rd, Yorktown rendezvoused with Enterprise and Hornet northeast of Midway. Together, the three carriers formed Task Force 16 and Task Force 17, the entire striking power of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Against them, the Japanese were bringing 4 fleet carriers, the elite of their navy, the same ships that had struck Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Task Force 16, met with Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, commanding Task Force 17 aboard Yorktown, to coordinate their battle plan. Intelligence indicated the Japanese would approach from the northwest. The American carriers would position themselves northeast of Midway, out of range of Japanese scout planes, waiting for the enemy to reveal himself. On the morning of June 4th, the wait ended. A PBY Catalina patrol plane spotted the Japanese carrier force and radioed its position. Almost immediately, land-based aircraft from Midway launched to attack. They achieved little, but they gave the American carriers the information they needed. The Japanese were exactly where the intelligence predicted they would be. At 0700, Spruance began launching his strike groups. Aircraft roared off the decks of Enterprise and Hornet, forming up into attack formations before heading west. Fletcher held Yorktown's aircraft back, waiting to see if additional Japanese carriers might appear. At 0838, a Japanese scout plane spotted the American carriers and radioed their position. The game of hide-and-seek was over. Both sides knew where the other was. Now it became a race to see who could strike first. Japanese Admiral Chuichi Nagumo faced a terrible decision. His aircraft were armed with bombs for attacking Midway. If he wanted to strike the American carriers, he needed to bring those aircraft below, remove the bombs, and reload them with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs designed for attacking ships. That would take at least an hour, during which his carriers would be vulnerable. He gave the order to rearm. It was the decision that would decide the battle. At 0930, Fletcher ordered Yorktown's aircraft to launch. Jimmy Morrison watched from his battle station as the carrier's remaining aircraft screamed down the deck and lifted into the sky. He knew what those pilots were flying into. Everyone on the ship knew. The Japanese fleet had hundreds of aircraft, dozens of anti-aircraft guns, and the best carrier pilots in the world. But the Americans had surprise. They had courage, and they had motivation. They were fighting for their homes, their families, their very survival. The next few hours became a confusing blur of reports and rumors. Radio messages crackled through the ship's communication system, often garbled or incomplete. The American torpedo bombers found the Japanese carriers and pressed home their attacks with suicidal bravery. Almost all of them were shot down, their torpedoes missing or failing to explode. It seemed like a disaster. But their sacrifice bought time and drew the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level, leaving the carriers vulnerable from above. At 10:22, American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown arrived over the Japanese fleet. They found the carriers in the middle of rearming their aircraft. Bombs and torpedoes were scattered across the hangar decks. Fuel lines were open. It was the worst possible moment to be attacked. 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were struck within minutes of each other. Bombs penetrated their decks and detonated among the armed and fueled aircraft waiting to launch. Secondary explosions ripped through the ships as torpedoes and bombs cooked off. Within moments, all 3 carriers were blazing infernos, transformed from fighting ships to funeral pyres. Aboard Yorktown, the crew celebrated. They'd done it. They'd stopped the Japanese. The cheering had barely begun when radar picked up incoming aircraft, lots of them. The 4th Japanese carrier, Hiryu, had escaped the initial attack. Now she was sending her aircraft to exact revenge. "Air raid warning! Air raid warning!" blared through the announcing system. "All hands, man your battle stations." Jimmy and his damage control team rushed to their stations, gathering firefighting equipment and damage control supplies. On the flight deck above them, the returning American aircraft landed, refueling and rearming as quickly as possible. The ship's anti-aircraft guns swung around, tracking the incoming raid. The Japanese aircraft appeared at 11:55, coming in low over the water, their approach masked by scattered clouds. The ship's lookout spotted them at 8 miles, and immediately the anti-aircraft batteries opened fire. The sky filled with black puffs of flak as 5-inch guns threw up a wall of steel. It wasn't enough. The Japanese pilots were skilled and determined. They pressed through the flak, boring in on Yorktown from multiple directions. The carrier twisted and turned, her captain throwing the huge ship into evasive maneuvers that sent men sliding across decks and equipment crashing loose from its securing. The first bomb hit near the island's superstructure, penetrating 3 decks before exploding. The blast killed dozens of men instantly and started fires throughout the ship's interior. The second bomb struck seconds later, hitting almost the same spot, expanding the damage and spreading the fires. The third bomb was the worst. It crashed through the flight deck right near Jimmy's patchwork repairs from Pearl Harbor and exploded in an ammunition storage area. The blast tore through the ship, ripping apart compartments and starting uncontrollable fires. Yorktown shuddered under the impact. Smoke poured from the wounds, and the ship began to lose way as damage to the engineering spaces forced the crew to secure the boilers. Jimmy found himself in a smoke-filled passageway, barely able to see, coughing violently. The damage control training kicked in automatically. He dropped to his knees where the air was clearer and crawled toward the nearest fire station to get breathing apparatus. All around him, men were fighting to save their ship. Fire parties dragged hoses through the smoke, pouring water onto blazes that seemed to grow faster than they could be extinguished. Medical teams moved wounded men to aid stations. Engineers worked frantically to restart boilers and restore power. In Damage Control Central, Commander Delaney coordinated the response, sending teams to the most critical areas, shifting resources as new problems emerged. Reports flooded in, each one describing a new crisis: fire in the forward mess deck, flooding in the starboard fuel tanks, steam line rupture in engine room 2. The wounded Yorktown was hemorrhaging from a dozen wounds. For 3 hours, the crew fought to save their ship. Slowly, painfully, they gained the upper hand. The fires were brought under control. The flooding was stopped. Emergency generators restored partial power. The engine room crews managed to restart 1 boiler, giving the ship enough steam to make 15 knots. Against all odds, Yorktown was recovering. Captain Buckmaster stood on the bridge, surveying the damage. The ship was hurt, no question. But she was still afloat, still moving. The patches that had been so hastily applied at Pearl Harbor had held. Even under the tremendous shock of multiple bomb hits, the welds had stayed intact. The ugly repairs that wouldn't have passed peacetime inspection had saved the ship. At 14:30, radar picked up another incoming raid. The crew, exhausted from fighting fires and making repairs, returned to their battle stations. But this time, the Japanese were after different prey. The attackers were torpedo bombers from Hiryu, and they were determined to finish what the dive bombers had started. The combat air patrol intercepted some of the attackers, shooting down several before they could release their weapons. But 6 torpedo bombers broke through the fighter screen and began their attack runs. Anti-aircraft fire from Yorktown and her screening destroyers created a wall of lead that the Japanese had to fly through. They flew through it anyway. 4 of the attackers were shot down before reaching their release point, but 2 succeeded. Their torpedoes hit Yorktown on her port side, one forward and one amidships. The explosions ripped enormous holes in the hull. Seawater flooded in through wounds 20 feet across. The ship immediately took on a severe list to port. In the engine rooms, the shock of the torpedo hits threw men off their feet and ruptured steam lines, escaping steam-filled compartments, scalding anyone who couldn't get out quickly enough. The lights went out as electrical systems failed. Emergency lighting came on, casting everything in an eerie red glow. Jimmy, thrown to the deck by the first explosion, scrambled to his feet and grabbed a battle lantern. Water was pouring into his section of the ship, rising rapidly. He could hear men shouting, calling for help, trying to organize a response, but the list was growing steeper, 30 degrees, 45 degrees. Equipment that had been secured was breaking loose, sliding across decks, crushing anyone in its path. The order came to abandon the engineering spaces. The flooding was too severe, the list too extreme. Men scrambled up ladders that were now nearly horizontal, dragging wounded shipmates with them. Those who couldn't climb fast enough found themselves in water that rose to their waists, then their chests, then over their heads. Captain Buckmaster made the hardest decision of his life. With the list approaching 70 degrees and the ship appearing on the verge of capsizing, he gave the order to abandon ship. The crew, disciplined even in disaster, moved in an orderly fashion to the high side of the deck. Destroyers moved in close, their crews throwing lines and scrambling nets to pull sailors from the water. Men jumped from the tilting deck, some falling 50 feet or more to reach the ocean. Others climbed down lines, hand over hand, until they could let go and swim the last few yards to the rescue ships. Jimmy found himself standing on what had once been the side of the ship, now serving as a deck as Yorktown lay almost on her side. All around him, sailors were jumping into the water. He could see the destroyers picking up men, could see life rafts being deployed, could see officers counting heads to make sure everyone got off. He looked down at the hull patches he'd spent 3 days creating, now exposed to the air as the ship rolled. The welds were still intact. Even under the tremendous stress of torpedo explosions and progressive flooding, his ugly repairs had held together. They'd done their job. They'd kept the ship fighting for one more battle. Then Jimmy jumped, hitting the water feet first and plunging deep below the surface. When he came up, gasping and coughing up sea water, a destroyer was already moving toward him. Sailors on deck were shouting encouragement, throwing him a line. He grabbed it and felt himself being pulled through the water towards safety. Behind him, Yorktown floated defiantly, refusing to sink despite her terrible wounds. The list had stabilized at about 60 degrees. Water continued to pour into her, but the subdivision of her hull, the watertight compartments, and the patches that had been so hastily made were keeping her afloat. The battle continued around her. American dive bombers found and destroyed Hiryu, completing the destruction of the Japanese carrier fleet. But for Yorktown and her crew, the fight was over. They'd been picked up by the destroyers and transferred to larger ships that would take them back to Pearl Harbor. Many of them, Jimmy included, stood on the decks of their rescue ships and watched their home their ship, still stubbornly floating as night fell. The next morning, a salvage team went back aboard Yorktown. The list had decreased slightly as water redistributed through the hull. Captain Buckmaster, desperate to save his ship, organized a skeleton crew to restart pumps and fight the flooding. For a day and a half, they worked, making slow but steady progress. The list decreased to 20 degrees. The flooding was controlled. It began to look like Yorktown might be saved after all. Then, on June 6th, the Japanese submarine Arshita 168 found the damaged carrier. The destroyer Hammond was alongside, providing power and pumping services. The submarine fired 4 torpedoes. 2 hit Yorktown. 1 hit Hammond. Hammond broke in half and sank within minutes, taking down many of her crew. The torpedoes that hit Yorktown struck in the same area that had been damaged by the earlier attacks, near the patches that Jimmy and his team had so carefully made. This time, the damage was too much. The welds that had held through bombing and earlier torpedoes simply couldn't withstand another massive shock. The patches failed. Water flooded into spaces that had been sealed. The list increased dramatically. By nightfall, it was clear that Yorktown was doomed. At dawn on June 7th, the carrier rolled over and sank, taking with her the bodies of those who had been lost in the battles, and carrying down the story of the hasty repairs that had given her one last chance to fight. But those repairs had succeeded. The ugly welds that wouldn't have passed inspection had held long enough for Yorktown to participate in the most important naval battle of the Pacific War. Her aircraft had helped sink 3 Japanese carriers. Her presence had forced the Japanese to divide their attention, protecting the other American carriers from attack. And her crew had fought with courage and skill, inflicting damage far beyond what anyone had thought possible. Jimmy Morrison survived the war. He returned to Oklahoma, went back to welding pipelines, got married, raised a family. He rarely talked about his time on Yorktown, about the 3 days at Pearl Harbor when he'd helped perform a miracle of emergency repair. When asked about it, he would simply say that he'd done his job, same as everyone else. But in the files of the Pearl Harbor Navy Yard, in the War Patrol reports and damage assessments, the story was recorded for history. The hasty repairs to USS Yorktown, completed in 72 hours by exhausted men working around the clock, had held together long enough to change the course of the war. The welds that looked ugly but stayed strong. The patches that wouldn't pass inspection but kept the ocean out. The work that was good enough when perfect wasn't possible. Years later, when naval architects studied Yorktown's design and damage reports, they were amazed by how well the emergency repairs had performed. The welds that Jimmy Morrison and his fellow damage control specialists made in that narrow void space near frame 97 had been subjected to forces far beyond their design limits. They'd been stressed by evasive maneuvers, shock loaded by bomb explosions, and twisted by the ship's progressive list. By all rights, they should have failed immediately, but they didn't. They held because they were made by skilled men who understood that sometimes strong mattered more than pretty. They held because workers gave everything they had, working beyond exhaustion, beyond what should have been humanly possible. They held because everyone involved, from Admiral Nimitz down to the youngest apprentice welder, understood what was at stake. The Battle of Midway turned the tide of the Pacific War. The Japanese lost 4 fleet carriers and their most experienced pilots. They never again mounted a major offensive operation. From Midway onward, Japan was on the defensive, slowly losing the war of attrition that American industrial might was winning. And it had all depended on getting 3 carriers to that battle. 3 carriers instead of 2. Enterprise and Hornet had certainly been important, but Yorktown, the wounded ship that shouldn't have been there, the carrier held together with ugly welds and hasty patches, had made the critical difference. In the decades since the war, Yorktown's story has been told many times. Books have been written, documentaries filmed, veterans interviewed. The focus is usually on the battle itself, on the brave pilots who pressed home their attacks, on the admirals who made the right decisions at the right times. But the story that deserves just as much attention is the story of what happened in those 3 days at Pearl Harbor. The story of 1,400 workers who performed the impossible. The story of naval engineers who threw away their rule books and focused on what needed to be done, rather than what regulations required. The story of welders like Jimmy Morrison who made repairs that wouldn't win any beauty contests, but kept a ship fighting when it mattered most. That's the real lesson of the Yorktown's ugly patches. That perfection is the enemy of good enough. That sometimes you don't have time to do things the right way, so you do them the way that works. That pride in craftsmanship is admirable, but mission accomplishment is essential. That when everything is on the line, when failure is not an option, human beings are capable of extraordinary things. The wreck of USS Yorktown lies in more than 16,000 feet of water northwest of Midway Atoll. She was found in 1998 by Robert Ballard, the same oceanographer who discovered the Titanic. The footage from that expedition shows the carrier sitting upright on the ocean floor, surprisingly intact despite her violent end. The cameras captured images of the bomb damage, the torpedo wounds, and yes, the hasty patches that had been applied in such desperate haste at Pearl Harbor. Those patches, made by exhausted men in impossible conditions, held together just long enough. And sometimes, just long enough is exactly what's needed to change the world.